So in the last lecture, I said, there are these scientific arguments and theological arguments for determinism. I didn't think either one was really a slam dunk, right? The science just isn't clear. Like, people will make these blanket statements about what science supposedly says, and a lot of times science is way less clear than they let on. I think a lot of times people who say stuff like that kind of say it out of ignorance of science, right? That it's not as cut and dried as they might like to believe. There are theological arguments for determinism, but, even within various faith traditions, those are, very controversial. And even if they weren't, they don't have a lot of punch outside those faith traditions, right? Even if, and I don't think they do, even if, say, Islam or Christianity said that you had to be a determinist, and again, I don't think they do, but even if they did, that really wouldn't have any force for someone who's not a Christian, who's not a Muslim, right? So, we're looking for a better argument for determinism. And Taylor's is really interesting because Taylor tries to give us a logical argument for determinism. He says, you don't have to do science, you don't have to get into religion. Simply the laws of logic will tell you that determinism is true, that we do not have free will. So let's look at Taylor's argument. So Taylor starts with a statement that I think we would all agree to. What is true about the past does not change and cannot be changed. It is true that Harry Truman won the 1948 election. There is nothing anyone could do now to change that fact. Even more mundane, smaller things, there's nothing you can do now to change them if they're in the past, right? I had a cup of coffee this morning. There's nothing I can do to change the fact that, but after 7, I brewed a cup of coffee, and then from 7 on into almost 8, I just sipped and drank my coffee, right? Tiny, mundane thing, but there's nothing I can do to change that fact now, right? Right? We all have this experience, we walk out of the test and we're like, oh my God, I set the equation up wrong. Those are all wrong. You can't go back and change it then, right? Or you say something stupid, it's out there, you can't change it. The past is set, right? We know this, we all agree to it. Taylor will also say every meaningful statement about the past is either true or false. Now look, there are a lot of statements about the past that we don't know whether they're true or false, right? Even that weirdo who does the Thomas Jefferson Hour might not know what Thomas Jefferson had for breakfast on April 12th, 1794, right? I mean, he probably does, right? But even he might not, right? I really hate that show. I mean, that's neither here nor there for free will. It's just that you can make a career out of doing Thomas Jefferson cosplay, I just find bizarre, to put it kindly. But anyway, let's say even that weirdo doesn't know what Thomas Jefferson had for breakfast on, some date, right? Even if he doesn't know, even if no one knows, even if it's lost to history what Thomas Jefferson had for breakfast on this particular morning, there is a fact of the matter about whether Jefferson even had breakfast and if he did, what he had for breakfast, right? The same goes for lots of other little facts in the past. No one might know them. No one might have ever known them, but they are true or false, right? I don't know how many hairs were on my head yesterday morning. No one will ever know. I don't see any way a human being could know that. But, you know, God exists. I guess he probably knows that. But, you know, none of us will ever know how many hairs were on my head yesterday morning. But there is some fact of the matter about how many there were, right? The same goes for every possible statement about the past. Every meaningful statement about the past is either true or false, and you can't change which they are. If it's false now, it will always be false. If it's true now, it will always be true. So here's what Taylor says. The future is not different from the past in this respect. Every statement about the future is either true or false. What's more, just like the past, you can't change them at all. We think the future and the past are different because, we know lots of things about the past. There are a lot of things we don't know about the future. But really, when you get down to it, facts about the future aren't special. They're just like these facts about the past no one knows about, right? Like what Thomas Jefferson had for breakfast on some particular morning, right? We don't know that, even for important stuff in the future, like who will win the 2024 presidential election. We don't know it, but Taylor would say just like statements about the past, they are either true or false, right? I don't know whether Joe Biden will win the 2024 presidential election is true or false, but, Taylor would say there is a fact of the matter about whether that's true or false, just as much as there's a fact of the matter about whether the statement Harry Truman won the 1948 presidential election is true or false. All right, so let's sketch Taylor's argument for determinism. Every statement about the future or past, he'd add the present too, is either true or false. We cannot change a false statement to a true one or a true one to a false one. For every action I will perform, there are true and false statements corresponding to that action, right? Am I going to have a second cup of coffee today? I don't know. But Taylor would say there is a fact of the matter about whether I will. The statement, I will have a second cup of coffee today, is either true or false. Nothing I can do to change it. Brings us to 4. It is impossible to change the truth or falsity of these statements. I will have another cup of coffee today is just as out of control as the one in the past. I had a cup of coffee at 8 this morning or 7 this morning, right? 5. If it is impossible to change the truth or falsity of these statements, it is impossible to act otherwise than we do. 6. Conclusion from that. Therefore, it is impossible to have acted otherwise than we do. Okay, so is this a good argument? The key premise here is premise 1. Every statement about the future or past is either true or false. So here's what Taylor says. Taylor says, well, the future is not different from the past. There's an older tradition in philosophy going back to Aristotle, one of the very first recognizable philosophers in the Western tradition, that says the future is different from the past. Aristotle would say all statements about the past are true or false. That's not the case about the future. Some statements about the future, in fact, most statements about the future that we're interested in, are neither true nor false. Why does Taylor think this, right? Why does Aristotle even go so far as to agreeing with Taylor's statement as to say, well, every statement about the past is true or false? Well, the reason that Taylor gives is this law of excluded middle. This is a law of logic. So excluded middle says P or not P. And this holds for everything. What this means is that every single statement, every single claim is either true or false. For anything you might state, either it's true or it's not. And now look, there are often some kind of dumb, I wouldn't go quite so far as to say dumb, but there are often, I think, some misplaced objections to excluded middle. You know, I remember once in a logic class, I was way back when I was in school, I wasn't teaching, I was actually in this class. Someone raises the objection to excluded middle. He says, well, look, it's not true that everything's black or white. How can this be true? I say that this is a misplaced objection because that's not what excluded middle says. Excluded middle doesn't say everything's either black or white. What excluded middle would say is everything is either white or it's not. Everything is either black or it's not. For anything you can point at, for any object, it's either black or it isn't, it's either white or it isn't, right? This student's objection was, well, what about shades of gray, right? And now the professor teaching this class was a humongous jerk. I mean, I really dislike this guy. And his response could have been nicer because, as I said, he was a huge jerk. He also had one of those very pompous and, just condescending British accents. Which is funny because he was from Australia, so I know I wasn't born talking like that. But anyway, so he said, in his, I think, fake British accent, well, if something's grey, well, it isn't white, now is it? If it's grey, it isn't black, now is it? Now, strip this guy's, response of its sarcasm and all, the fact that he's a pompous jerk. He's right? Excluded middle would say, gray is no objection to it because things that are gray are not white. Perfectly consistent with the statement, everything's white or it isn't, that there are gray things in the world because gray isn't white, right? Perfectly consistent with everything's black or it's not, for there being gray things, well, gray is not black, right? So, excluded middle, this law of logic. And so Aristotle says, look, excluded middle, Aristotle was one of the fathers of logic. And Aristotle would say, at least in the Western tradition, Aristotle would say, look, excluded middle is true for the present and past. It's not true for the future, though. Taylor, on the other hand, would say, look, it's true for the past, present, and future. That's how he gets his premise one. And if you grant Taylor this, his whole argument works. And here's Taylor's challenge to somebody like Aristotle, and I think on the face of it is a good one. Look, Aristotle, what makes the future special? You will admit that this holds for the present and the past. Excluded middle, every statement is true or false, holds for the present and the past, but you just say, well, it doesn't hold for the future. You need some argument for that, right? You can't just claim that because the future seems different to us. Why in the world should there be this one exception to this law of logic? And lo and behold, it's the future, and that preserves this idea of free will that a lot of us are obviously invested in, right? You'll hear philosophers talk about things being ad hoc, And sometimes it's not clear what that means, but it's basically a lot of times you just make some random exception to what you believe or your theory to save beliefs that, are near and dear to you, right? No good rationale for this exception. You just want to save some belief, some commitment that you like or that's dear to you, right? And Taylor will say, well, that's what you're doing by saying that excluded middle holds for everything except the future. You want to believe in free will. You want to preserve this idea of responsibility for our actions. You don't want to be hard determinists. So you just say, well, it doesn't count for the future. That, Taylor will say, there's something very suspicious about that. Okay, so next lecture, we'll get into that more deeply. Is there something suspicious about opening up this exception to excluded middle, or is there more to be said for Aristotle's position?